What's going on, everybody? My name is TrendKiLL. I've got my body back. That means it's time for another episode of Know Your Enemy. So if you couldn't tell, we're going through the free gods first. We've already discussed a hunter, a guardian, and a mage. Today we're going to be talking about the free assassin. This video is about Thor, the god of thunder. Okay, so by now you guys probably know the first thing we do in each one of these videos is we take a brief look at a visual representation of what each god is good at. Now you can see Thor has no healing, he can't heal himself or his teammates, and he has extreme mobility. He's one of the most mobile gods in the game, and we'll explain why here in a little bit, but everything else is pretty much spread very evenly. He's got decent control, damage, utility, and defense. Again, no healing, very high mobility. Now, assuming you've read his abilities, his kit is pretty straightforward, but we are going to go through a few of the highlights. Remember that his passive gives him an innate physical power buff. That's one of the very few passives or the very few things in the game that's going to give you just physical power for free. So essentially, in a fight with 3 or more of Thor's enemies, you can assume that he's approximately an item ahead of you physical damage-wise because he gets that innate 45 physical power just from his passive. So you want to be careful boxing a Thor in a team fight. Now, beyond his passive, also remember that he can teleport to his hammer, Mjolnir, anytime he throws it. And this is what gives him a ton of mobility, so be wary of that. And lastly, he is immune to knockup while he's in his Berserker Barrage, his third ability. Other than that, everything else is extremely straightforward. Alright, let's check out Thor's mechanics. Now, Thor has more tips for him than any of the other gods I've done thus far, so I'm going to do my best to keep this at a consistent kind of quick pace while making sure that I don't leave out any of the vital information. So first things first, and this is really more of a tip for any time you're playing the game in general, but specifically if you're playing against a god like Thor who can ultimate up into the air and come crashing down in any direction, you want to be able to watch him so you can see where he's headed, and with the restricted camera pitch that is on by default, you can't do that. So to fix that, what you want to do is from the main menu, head up to your settings, which is in the top left-hand corner. It's the little blue gear. Click that and go over to the controls tab and then unclick restricted camera pitch. That will allow you to look around freely. You can look up to the sky, you can look down at the ground, you can look in any direction you want instead of being restricted to just basically looking straight ahead. Believe me, Thor's ultimate is already powerful enough in the mobility and the ganking potential that it adds to his kit. You don't want to add more to that by not being able to see where it's coming from. Alright, so let's get into the abilities. First off, let's talk about Mjolnir's attunement. This is his first ability. It's the hammer throw that he has. Remember that the hammer throw can be teleported to at any time. Whether it's going away from him or coming back to him, he can teleport to that hammer. This includes teleporting through walls. So when you saw Thor's mobility off the charts on the graph earlier, this is a big reason why. So a lot of the times what you may see him do is ultimate in to get a kill and then use his teleport to quickly get out of harm's way, and that's how most assassins should be played. Get in, get a kill, get out. Another thing you want to remember is that the hammer is like a boomerang, and again, we've already discussed this, but it goes away from him and then comes back to him. So remember, if you get caught in that boomerang and it hits you going away from him and back to him, it will deal triple ability damage. If we look at some quick math, let's not talk about protections or let's not talk about scaling, let's just talk about the base damage. At rank 5 is 210 damage. If he hits you as the hammer is flying away from him, it will deal 210 damage to you, but on the way back, it will deal double damage, so 420 damage for a total of 630 damage, or triple what the base damage of that ability is. So here's the tricky part. Thor can throw his hammer, and if timed properly, can hit you on the way away from him and on the way back to him, and right after it hits you the second time, can teleport to it and go right into his third ability, Berserker's Barrage, for a ton of burst damage. So you've got to be very careful about getting hit with what I call the double tap. You don't want to get hit twice with that hammer because that puts you at the risk of taking a ton of damage. Alright, so let's move on and talk about his second ability, Tectonic Rift. If you watched my Ymir guide, you'll know that this is a player-created wall a lot like Ymir's second ability, Ice Wall. Now, there are a lot of differences between Ymir's wall and Thor's Tectonic Rift, however, the big one being that if you hit an enemy god with your Tectonic Rift, they will be stunned. This gives Thor one of the longest distance stuns in the game, which makes it an extremely great setup ability. If Tectonic Rift is used correctly, it almost guarantees a Mjolnir's Attunement double tap, which can then be comboed into a teleport followed by a Berserker's Barrage. So again, we talked about that combo earlier. It's a ton of burst damage, and Tectonic Rift almost guarantees that that's going to hit. So you're starting to see a theme in all of these Know Your Enemy videos. You cannot just look at each god's ability completely separately. You have to look at how they work as a kit. That's why it is called a kit. All of the abilities will generally combo together in some way to create some sort of ability rotation. One more quick thing about Tectonic Rift. If you remember from my Amir guide, I told you not to run from an Amir in the jungle because he's likely to cut off your path and trap you in a dead end. Well, that also goes for Thor. While it's not as easy to do, he can cut off your path with his Tectonic Rift. But I did say Amir's wall in the lane is really not that scary because you can just run around it. That's not the case with Tectonic Rift. Thor's wall is much longer than Amir, so he can almost cut off an entire lane with this wall, so you've got to be very careful overextending yourself if you do not have a jump or a teleport to get over or back through the wall. Now, as far as his third ability, Berserker's Barrage, is concerned, there's not much that can be said about this ability that hasn't already been said. Do remember that it is a ton of burst damage if he catches you in all of it, and also remember that he is immune to knockup while he's channeling this ability, so don't try to do anything that's going to knock him out of it because that's not going to work. And then there was his ultimate, Anvil of Dawn. This is what gives Thor his massive amounts of mobility. If you've never played Thor, this is what it looks like in his ultimate. He flies up in the air, and while he's up there, he can choose any direction he wants to go, and he can come crashing down in that massive radius on top of somebody, stunning them and dealing a considerable amount of damage. Now, on top of the obvious mobility benefits that you gain from this ability, being able to fly up in the air and basically teleport a long distance, this also adds a lot of sneakiness to Thor, which is what makes him an assassin. First off, Thor's channeling of his ability is a very distinct sound, so when you hear it, you know exactly what's happening. However, if he is far enough away from you, you will not hear the channeling of his ability. You will only feel the force of him coming crashing down on you without any warning whatsoever. Now, the only way to counter this is to have wards in the jungle so that you can see him channeling his ability rather than hearing it. That way you at least have some sort of idea that Thor's about to bring the thunder. The issue with this is, if you look at the minimap, these are two very basic and very acceptable warding positions. With wards here, other than a few exceptions, there is no way from the jungle into the lane without going through the wards or through the towers. Since it's not likely they're going to come from behind you through your tower to attack you, and you can see them coming through their tower, you're fairly safe from this position. However, Thor can start channeling Anvil of Dawn from far beyond those wards and still come crashing down on you. A very common place for Thor to start channeling his ultimate is inside Gold Fury, where if you have warded in the normal basic positions, you will be both blind and deaf to his ultimate. So warding a little deeper into the jungle could end up saving your life at the cost of another ward or two. And last but not least, one more tip for Anvil of Dawn. Remember, we've already talked about Tectonic Rift, stun, into Mjolnir's attunement, into teleport, into Berserker's Barrage. You can add Anvil of Dawn to this combo and kind of change up the order of abilities. So the main combo that you're going to see is somebody stunning you with Anvil of Dawn, going right into Berserker's Barrage, coming out of Berserker's Barrage into a Tectonic Rift to stun you again, and then landing Mjolnir's attunement. Follow that up with some auto attacks, and you can really 100-0 somebody in a very short amount of time. The good news is that if an enemy Thor does this to you, at that point, they are completely out of all of their abilities. So if you manage to last through that or live through that, whether it's from an Aegis or you just have some physical defense, you then have the ability to think about boxing him because he literally can do nothing other than run around and auto attack. So just remember that while Thor is extremely mobile, once his ultimate and his Mjolnir's attunement are on cooldown, he is completely vulnerable and is no longer mobile at all. So there you have it, guys. Hopefully this video has helped you learn how to play against Thor, because let's face it, you gotta be safe on the battleground of the gods. You don't want to get ganked, right? So anyway, thanks for stopping by and hanging out with me, guys, and hopefully I will see you next week when we talk about Guan Yu, the Chinese Saint of War.